Millionaire CEO yells, "You don't belong here." The quiet janitor answers, "I'm here for my daughter." The large glass building of the company stood tall in the middle of the city, shining in the early morning light. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but full of energy. It was the day of a big meeting where the CEO had called all top executives. Everyone knew that this meeting was not just another gathering, it was about the future direction of the company, a place where decisions worth millions would be made. The long polished table in the boardroom was already surrounded by well-dressed managers, each holding their files, laptops, and pens, ready to take notes and impress the man sitting at the head of the table. The CEO was a man known for his confidence, his wealth, and his strong personality. He had built a reputation as someone who demanded perfection from his employees. People admired him, but they also feared him. His sharp eyes noticed everything, and he never liked being distracted. For him, the boardroom was sacred, a place only for people who had worked hard enough to earn a seat. As the meeting began, he cleared his throat and started to speak about numbers, profits, and new goals. Everyone listened carefully, nodding at the right times, writing down notes, and making sure they looked serious. The air in the room was heavy with pressure. Then, something unusual caught the CEO's attention. At the far end of the room, near the door, a man stood quietly. He was not dressed in a suit. He did not carry a file or a laptop. His clothes were simple and slightly worn. His shoes looked old, and his hands showed the marks of years of physical work. It was the janitor, the quiet man who usually went unnoticed as he cleaned the halls, polished the floors, and carried out his daily duties. The CEO paused in the middle of his sentence. His eyebrows came together in surprise and irritation. What was a janitor doing in the boardroom during such an important meeting? The executives looked at each other, whispering silently with their eyes, also wondering the same thing. Nobody dared to say anything, but everyone was waiting for the CEO's reaction. Finally, the CEO's voice echoed loudly across the room. "You don't belong here," he shouted, pointing directly at the janitor. His words were sharp and filled with authority. The sudden outburst shocked everyone in the room. Pens froze mid-air, papers rustled, and a heavy silence fell. All eyes turned toward the janitor. The janitor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes but a calm face, stood still. He did not flinch or look embarrassed. For years, he had lived with people looking past him, ignoring him, or sometimes even speaking to him with little respect. But at that moment, in that room full of powerful people, he decided not to walk away quietly. He took a slow breath, his eyes steady but gentle. The room waited for him to leave, but instead, his soft voice broke the silence. "I'm here for my daughter," he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight. The executives exchanged shocked glances, not sure what he meant. The CEO, still frowning, leaned forward. "Your daughter," he repeated, his tone filled with disbelief. The janitor nodded. "Yes," he said quietly. His voice was calm, but behind it was a strength that no one in that room could ignore. The room remained silent, but now the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear after the CEO's anger. It was a silence of curiosity, of confusion, and of something deeper, respect trying to find its way through. The janitor did not explain more at that moment. He stood with quiet dignity, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes firm but humble. He had no fancy suit, no expensive watch, no title before his name, yet there was something in his voice that made the room of powerful men and women pause. The CEO looked unsettled. He had expected the man to quickly apologize and leave the room. He had not expected him to answer back, and certainly not with words that carried so much meaning. For the first time in many years, the CEO found himself speechless in front of someone who held no power, no wealth, no position in the company. One of the younger executives shifted in his chair. Another cleared his throat, but still, no one dared to speak. The janitor's words hung in the air, waiting to be understood. The CEO finally spoke again, though his voice had softened just a little. "Explain yourself," he demanded, but this time his tone was not as sharp. It carried a note of curiosity, almost unwilling respect. The janitor looked around the room, his eyes briefly meeting those of the executives before returning to the CEO. He said slowly, "My daughter works here. She was asked to be part of this meeting today. I came because I wanted to see her moment." His words touched something in the room. Several executives straightened in their chairs, suddenly realizing who the janitor's daughter might be. They had seen new young faces joining the company recently, but none of them had ever guessed that one of those bright young talents was the child of the quiet man who swept the floors late at night when everyone else had gone home. The CEO leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had built his empire on power and discipline, always believing that only the strongest deserved to be in that room. Yet here was a man, a janitor, speaking with a quiet courage that unsettled him. The janitor, on the other hand, felt no pride in standing there. He was not there to challenge anyone or to make himself important. He was only there for one reason: to support his daughter, the young woman who had worked hard, who had sacrificed fun, who had spent endless nights studying to achieve the dream he had always wanted for her. He remembered the long shifts, the double jobs, the aching back, and the tired mornings. Every mop he had pushed, every floor he had cleaned, had been for her future. And now that future had brought him to this very room, even if he was not invited. His words were few, but his presence spoke loudly. The executives began to see the situation differently. Some lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with the way the CEO had shouted at him. Others stared at the janitor with a new sense of respect. The CEO, still holding on to his pride, tried to keep control of the room, but something had shifted. He no longer had the same power over the moment. The janitor's quiet dignity had changed the atmosphere, and everyone could feel it. The meeting was supposed to be about numbers, profits, and strategies. But now, before any of that, there was a story unfolding, a story of a father's love, of sacrifice, of someone who had been invisible for years but was suddenly standing at the center of attention. The janitor said no more. He simply waited, his presence calm but unshakable. The executives leaned forward, sensing that something important was about to happen, something that would not just be about business but about humanity itself. And in that moment, everyone in the room understood that the story of the day was not just about a millionaire CEO or a successful company. It was also about the quiet man in simple clothes who had dared to stand in the room where people said he did not belong, and the reason he gave, "I'm here for my daughter," was stronger than any business deal that could ever be made. Evie with silence after the janitor's quiet reply. The CEO, a man who was never used to being challenged, sat back in his chair, his sharp eyes fixed on the janitor. Around the long polished table, executives shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Some kept their eyes low, while others glanced at one another with silent questions. It was not every day that a man in simple clothes stood firm in front of the most powerful person in the building. The janitor stood near the door, calm but unshaken. His words, "I'm here for my daughter," had changed the atmosphere of the meeting. No one knew exactly what he meant. They had seen him cleaning the hallways, carrying buckets, sweeping late at night when most of them were already home with their families. But they never thought he had a reason to stand in this room other than by mistake. The CEO finally leaned forward, his voice calmer but still filled with authority. "Your daughter?" he asked again. "What do you mean by that? Who is your daughter?" The janitor's eyes softened as he answered. "She works here. She was chosen to be part of this meeting. Today is her first time in this room, and I came not to disturb anyone but to see her moment. I have always stood at the back during her important days. I stood at the back during her school plays, her debates, her graduation. I was only standing here to watch her step forward." His words touched something in the air. The executives listened quietly, and many of them felt a strange warmth in their chest. They could picture it: a father in old clothes standing quietly in school halls, clapping softly when his daughter did well, staying invisible so she could shine. The CEO raised his eyebrows, trying to remember which young employee could possibly be the janitor's child. There were many new faces, bright, educated, ambitious. One of them must belong to this man. His pride resisted the thought, but curiosity pulled at him. He finally asked, "Who is she?" The janitor looked around the room, and for the first time, his eyes rested on a young woman sitting halfway down the table. She was in her mid-twenties, neatly dressed in a simple but elegant suit. She had a folder in front of her, her hands clasped tightly on it. Her face was pale, caught between fear and pride, knowing that all eyes had turned toward her. She slowly stood up, her chair making a small sound on the floor. Her voice was gentle but steady. "He is my father," she said, looking around the table. Her words sent a ripple through the room. The quiet janitor who everyone had passed without notice was the father of the new junior manager, the one who had been given the chance to present her idea in this very meeting. The executives exchanged surprised looks. Some had seen her working late in her corner office, preparing files, staying focused on her tasks. None of them had connected her to the man who swept the floors. The CEO studied her carefully. He had noticed her before: sharp, hard-working, a young woman who seemed determined to prove herself. He remembered her reports, her emails, and how she had impressed a few of the senior managers with her fresh ideas. But never had he imagined she was the daughter of the janitor he barely looked at in the hallways. The young woman's face was flushed, but her eyes were filled with strength. She looked at the CEO and then at the room. "I know this is unusual," she said softly, "but my father has always been there for me. Every step I took in life, he stood quietly in the background. Today is important for me, and he only wanted to do what he has always done: stand at the back and watch me." Her words carried no embarrassment, no shame. Only gratitude and love. The executives listened closely, many of them moved. They were people of success and wealth, but not all of them could say they had someone in their lives who had sacrificed so much silently for their success. The CEO's fingers tapped slowly on the table. He was not a man who liked to lose control, and yet he felt something inside him shift. He looked at the janitor again. For years, he had seen this man in the hallways and thought of him only as a worker whose job was to keep the building clean. But now he was forced to see him differently: not just as a janitor, but as a father, a man who had worked through sweat and exhaustion to give his daughter a better life. The janitor did not speak further. He stood quietly, his presence alone telling the story of his life. His back carried the weight of years of labor, his hands roughened by endless work, but his eyes were proud. The young woman slowly sat down, but the atmosphere had already changed. The executives whispered softly among themselves, their expressions different from before. Some looked at the janitor with respect, others at the daughter with admiration. One of the older executives, a man with gray hair and a gentle voice, finally spoke up. "Sir," he said to the CEO, "perhaps it would not hurt to let him stay. He is not here to interfere, only to support his daughter." The CEO glanced at him, then at the others. A few nodded subtly in agreement. It was a rare moment inside this room where money, power, and titles usually decided everything. People were now moved by something simple yet powerful: a father's love. The CEO hesitated, but he realized that dismissing the janitor now would not only seem cruel but also break the spirit of the young woman who was about to present. And he knew the meeting was too important to let emotions ruin the focus. He gave a short nod. "Very well," he said firmly, though his voice carried less arrogance now. "But let us proceed." The janitor lowered his head slightly in gratitude, then stepped back into the corner of the room. He did not want to take attention away from his daughter. His purpose was only to see her, to stand silently as he had always done. The daughter looked at him briefly, their eyes meeting for just a second. In that glance was a world of memories: the nights he came home late but still asked about her studies, the mornings when he walked her to school before heading to work, the times when he skipped meals to save for her books. She carried all of that inside her as she prepared to present her work. The CEO cleared his throat, trying to bring the meeting back to order. Yet deep inside, a small part of him was unsettled. For years, he had believed that belonging in this room was about wealth, education, and position. But the janitor's quiet strength had planted a thought he could not shake: perhaps belonging was not only about titles, but about sacrifice and heart. The executives opened their files again, but their eyes kept flicking toward the young woman and her father in the corner. They knew the meeting was about to move forward, but none of them could deny that something significant had already happened before the first presentation had even begun. The janitor stood still, his posture humble but his presence unshakable. He was invisible no more. He had entered the room as a man who was told he didn't belong, but his words had changed everything. And as his daughter prepared to stand and speak, the entire room realized this was no ordinary meeting. It was the beginning of a story none of them would forget. The young woman sat with her file in front of her, her heart beating faster than ever. She could feel the weight of the entire room's attention pressing down on her. For a moment, she wished she could disappear, but then her eyes caught sight of her father standing quietly at the back. He wasn't saying anything, he wasn't even moving much, but his presence gave her the courage she needed. He had always been there for her, and today, she would not let him down. The CEO turned his sharp gaze toward her. "Well," he said firmly, "it seems today is an important day for you. If you are ready, you may begin." She stood slowly, gathering her courage. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the file, but her voice was steady. She looked at the faces around the long table: executives in sharp suits, people much older and more experienced than she was. It felt intimidating, yet she reminded herself that she had earned this chance. "My name is Aisha," she began softly. "I joined this company a few months ago, and today I am here to share an idea that I believe can bring new growth for us. But before I begin my presentation, I want to say something personal." Some of the executives leaned forward with curiosity. It was unusual for a junior manager to begin a presentation with personal words. The CEO frowned slightly but allowed her to continue. She took a deep breath and said, "Many of you may not know this, but the man standing at the back is my father. He works here as a janitor. Some of you may have seen him in the hallways. For me, he is the reason I am standing here today. If I speak with confidence, if I hold this file of ideas, it is because of him." The room went still again. Even the CEO, who had been ready to cut her off, stayed silent. There was something powerful in the way she spoke: simple, honest, and without shame. She looked down at her father for a moment before continuing. "When I was a little girl, he used to come home late at night, tired from working long hours. But no matter how tired he was, he would sit with me, asking if I had finished my homework. Sometimes, he would fall asleep on the chair, but he never stopped encouraging me. He worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to pay for my books, my school fees, and later my college fees. Every time I wanted to give up, he reminded me of the dreams I once shared with him." Her voice trembled slightly, but she kept going. "There were days when he did not eat properly so that I could eat. There were nights when he went to work sick, just so I would not miss my tuition. He has swept floors, carried heavy loads, and faced humiliation, but he never complained. He always smiled and said, 'One day, you will stand where I could not.' And today, I stand here not because of my own strength, but because of his sacrifices." Many in the room lowered their eyes. Some executives who had once ignored the janitor in the hallway now looked at him differently. The quiet man at the back, who never asked for attention, was suddenly the strongest figure in the room. Aisha's voice grew stronger. People sometimes measure worth by wealth, titles, or power. But I believe true worth is measured by sacrifice, by love, and by the strength to keep going no matter how hard life becomes. My father belongs to none of your categories, but to me, he is the richest man I know. He has given me everything, and I am proud to be his daughter. The janitor stood still, but his eyes glistened. He had never wanted praise or recognition. For years, he worked in silence, only hoping that one day his daughter would live a life better than his. Hearing her speak these words in front of the most powerful people in the company was more than he had ever dreamed of. The CEO shifted in his chair. He was a man who had always believed that only the tough, the educated, the wealthy deserved to be in high places. Yet listening to the young woman speak, he could not deny that there was a truth here that no business rule could ignore. Finally, Aisha opened her file and began her actual presentation. Her hands no longer trembled, her voice no longer shook. With her father watching, she spoke with passion and confidence. She explained her project step by step, using clear examples, charts, and data. She talked about a new way the company could expand into a fresh market, how they could use technology in smarter ways, and how they could save costs without losing quality. The executives leaned in, listening carefully. Some nodded, impressed by her fresh perspective. Others scribbled notes, realizing that her ideas were worth serious attention. The CEO himself listened more closely than he had expected to. At first, he wanted to find flaws in her proposal, but as she continued, he found himself respecting the thought and effort she had put into it. Her words carried not just intelligence but also sincerity. She was not speaking just to impress, she was speaking because she truly believed her idea could make a difference. And that sincerity made her presentation stronger than any polished speech. Every few minutes, her eyes flicked toward the back of the room, where her father stood. He didn't smile, he didn't move much, but she could feel his silent support. It gave her strength like nothing else could. By the time she finished, the room was quiet again. Not the silence of doubt, but the silence of people absorbing something meaningful. The CEO tapped his pen slowly against the table, his face unreadable. The other executives glanced at one another, clearly impressed but waiting to see what the CEO would say. Before he could speak, the older executive with gray hair, who had earlier defended the janitor, spoke up again. "That was one of the most thoughtful presentations I've heard in a long time," he said warmly. "Not only is the idea strong, but the passion behind it is clear. It deserves serious consideration." Several others nodded in agreement. Aisha lowered her eyes humbly, whispering a quiet thank you. The CEO finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He studied her carefully, then looked at her father. The janitor met his gaze, calm and steady. The CEO was not used to being challenged by men like him, but something inside him was changing. He cleared his throat. "Your proposal is better than I expected," he admitted. His words were simple, but everyone in the room knew this was his way of giving recognition. He turned his eyes toward the janitor once more, and for the first time, there was no disdain in them, only thoughtfulness. Aisha sat down slowly, her heart still racing but filled with relief. She had done it. She had not only shared her idea but also spoken about her father in the way he deserved. She had turned what began as humiliation into a moment of pride. At the back of the room, the janitor closed his eyes for a moment, as if silently thanking life. He had worked through years of pain, sacrifice, and invisibility, and now he was watching his daughter stand tall in the very place where people once said he did not belong. The meeting was not over, but for the janitor and his daughter, the most important moment had already happened. She had spoken her truth, she had presented her work, and she had shown the world that behind her stood a man whose quiet sacrifices had built her strength. The executives turned their attention back to the files in front of them, but deep inside, each of them knew they had just witnessed something more meaningful than any chart or number. They had seen a story of love, resilience, and dignity unfold in front of their eyes. And though the CEO tried to continue the meeting as usual, he could not shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted forever. The meeting continued after Aisha's presentation, but the air in the room felt completely different. The executives flipped through their files, trying to return to their usual focus on numbers and strategies, but their minds kept returning to the moment they had just witnessed. A young woman had stood with courage, speaking not only about her ideas but also about her father, the quiet janitor who now stood humbly at the back of the room. The CEO leaned back in his chair, his pen still in his hand, but he was not writing anything. For the first time in years, his thoughts wandered away from profits and targets. He had always believed the company's success rested on discipline, hierarchy, and power. To him, the boardroom was sacred, a place only for people who carried weighty titles and spotless suits. But now he found himself looking again at the janitor, who stood silently with folded hands, eyes focused not on anyone else but on his daughter. There was something in that man's calmness that unsettled him. It was not arrogance, not pride, not even a demand for recognition. It was simply dignity. The CEO realized that this man, despite his plain clothes and roughened hands, carried a strength that could not be measured on a balance sheet. Meanwhile, the executives began to discuss Aisha's proposal. Questions were asked, points debated, and data examined. She responded with clarity and confidence, her voice steady even when the questions grew tough. The CEO noticed how the room leaned toward her, how her ideas were not being dismissed but carefully considered. Some executives even smiled in quiet approval, impressed by her composure. From the corner, her father watched every moment. His face carried no grand expression, but deep inside his heart was overflowing with pride. He remembered the nights when she would sit at the small wooden table in their modest home, surrounded by books, struggling to understand complex lessons. He remembered the times she would fall asleep with her head on her notebooks, and he would gently cover her with a blanket before leaving for his night shift. Every moment of sacrifice seemed worth it now. The CEO asked a final question, his tone firm but less sharp than before. Why do you believe this idea will work when others have failed? Aisha looked directly at him, her eyes steady. Because I have lived my whole life making something work out of very little. I know how to turn limits into opportunities. That is what my father taught me. This project is not about having endless resources, it's about using what we have wisely and with heart. That is why I believe it will succeed. The CEO was silent for a long moment. Her answer was simple, but it struck him deeply. He had built his empire on wealth and power, but this young woman spoke from a place of struggle and resilience. Some executives nodded slowly, moved by her honesty. The older man with gray hair, who had earlier spoken in her favor, smiled quietly. Sometimes, he said gently, the best leaders are shaped not by privilege but by hardship. The CEO did not reply immediately. He only glanced again at the janitor. Their eyes met for a brief second. For years, he had walked past this man without a thought. Now, looking at him, he felt an unfamiliar sense of humility rising in his chest. The discussion about the project continued for another hour. Charts were displayed, numbers calculated, and predictions argued over. But no matter how technical the conversation grew, the presence of the janitor remained in the back of everyone's mind. The story of sacrifice and quiet strength lingered in the air, giving weight to every word his daughter spoke. As the meeting neared its end, the CEO called for a short break. Executives stood up, stretching their legs, some whispering quietly among themselves. Aisha closed her file and sat down, breathing deeply. She had done it. She had spoken her truth, she had presented her work, and now all she could do was wait. Her father gave her a small nod from the corner. It was not a wide smile or a grand gesture, but it was enough. That nod carried years of love, encouragement, and pride. She felt her heart warm, knowing she had made him proud. During the break, a few executives approached the janitor. At first, they did not know what to say. For years, they had walked past him without a glance, and now they felt almost embarrassed. One of them finally spoke softly, "You must be very proud of your daughter." The janitor gave a small, humble smile. "I am," he replied simply. "She is my dream come true." Another executive, a woman with kind eyes, asked gently, "How did you manage to support her education with your work?" The janitor shrugged lightly, as if it were nothing extraordinary. "I just did what any father would do. I worked, I saved, I sacrificed where I had to. It was not easy, but every time I saw her studying, I knew it was worth it. She always had a spark in her, and I only wanted to make sure it didn't go out." The executives listened quietly, some nodding, some lowering their eyes with respect. They realized that this man, who they had overlooked for years, had more determination and dedication than many of them. When the break ended, everyone returned to their seats. The CEO resumed his position at the head of the table, but his voice no longer carried the same sharpness. There was a heaviness in his tone, as if he, too, was reflecting on something far greater than business. He turned toward Aisha. "Your idea has been heard. We will review it closely and decide on the next steps. But regardless of the decision, I want you to know that you presented yourself well today." It was the closest thing to praise she could have expected from him, and she accepted it with a quiet nod. "Thank you, sir." The janitor stood silently at the back, not asking for attention, not seeking recognition. For him, the words were not necessary. What mattered was that his daughter had been given a chance, and she had used it with dignity. The CEO tried to continue with other matters of the meeting, but his mind kept drifting. He thought about his own life, the path he had taken, the privileges he had enjoyed. He realized he had never known what it meant to struggle the way this janitor had, never known the depth of sacrifice it took to lift someone else higher while remaining in the shadows. As the meeting finally ended, chairs were pushed back and papers gathered, but no one left the room quite the same as they had entered. The executives carried with them not just notes on business plans but a story that would linger in their minds. The janitor waited quietly as people filed out. A few more executives stopped to nod at him respectfully. Some even smiled. He did not expect it, but he accepted it humbly. His daughter walked up to him, her eyes shining. "Thank you for being here," she whispered. He shook his head softly. "No," he said with quiet pride, "thank you for being here. This is your moment. I only came to see it." The CEO remained seated for a while longer, watching the scene unfold. Something inside him had shifted. The words "you don't belong here" echoed in his mind, but now they felt empty, almost foolish. He realized that belonging was not about clothes, money, or titles. Belonging was about the strength of spirit, the sacrifices made, and the love that carried someone forward. He watched as the janitor and his daughter walked toward the door together. For the first time, he felt a sense of respect for the man he had once dismissed. The janitor had come into the room quietly, but he had left behind a lesson that no executive would forget. And as the door closed behind them, the CEO knew that the company's future would not just be shaped by profits, but by people like the young woman with big ideas, and people like the quiet man who had given everything for her to stand where she stood today. When the meeting ended, the boardroom slowly emptied. The executives left with their files in hand, their minds full not only of business numbers but also of the story they had just witnessed. For years, many of them had walked past the janitor without even greeting him, yet today they had looked into his life for the first time. Some felt respect, others felt guilt, but all of them carried away a memory that would stay with them. The CEO remained seated longer than usual, staring at the polished table. He had shouted "You don't belong here," at the beginning of the meeting with full authority, believing those words to be true. But now, those same words echoed in his mind with shame. He had been proven wrong, not by argument or defiance, but by quiet dignity and love. The janitor had not shouted back, had not demanded respect. He had only spoken one simple truth: I'm here for my daughter. And that truth had changed the atmosphere of the entire room. Meanwhile, the janitor and his daughter stepped out of the boardroom together. The hallway felt quieter than usual. Aisha carried her file close to her chest, her face glowing with relief and pride. She turned to her father and whispered, I was so nervous, but when I saw you standing there, I found my strength. Her father smiled gently, a smile that carried years of sacrifice and love. You did not need me, he said softly. You already had the strength inside you. I only came to see you shine. They walked down the long hallway together, their steps slow, their hearts full. A few employees passing by looked at them with curiosity. Some of them, who had never even noticed the janitor before, now greeted him with a respectful nod. He returned their gestures politely but without pride. For him, the recognition was not important. His daughter's moment was all that mattered. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the tall glass windows of the company, the CEO remained in his office. He could not shake the thoughts that filled his mind. For years, he had measured people by their titles, their achievements, and their status. He had believed that only those with wealth and power deserved respect in his world. But today, one man had quietly challenged all of his beliefs. The janitor, a man he had dismissed as invisible, had shown him the meaning of true worth. The CEO finally stood and walked out of his office. His steps carried him down the hall until he reached the janitor's room, a small space where cleaning supplies were stored. The janitor was there, putting away his broom and mop. He looked up in surprise as the CEO entered. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the CEO said quietly, I owe you an apology. The janitor blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. He had never imagined the CEO would lower his voice to him. The CEO continued, when I told you that you did not belong in that room, I was wrong. Today, I realized something I had forgotten, that belonging is not about titles or money. It is about the sacrifices we make, the values we hold, and the people we raise. You have given this company more than you know. You have given us your daughter, and she is remarkable. And for that, I owe you my respect. The janitor's eyes softened, and he shook his head gently. I don't need an apology, sir, he replied humbly. I only came for my daughter. That was enough for me. But the CEO insisted, his tone sincere. No. You deserve more than silence. From this day, you will never be unseen in this building again. The janitor lowered his eyes, his heart touched but his humility intact. He had never asked for recognition, but hearing those words filled him with quiet pride. The next day, whispers moved through the company. People spoke about what had happened in the boardroom. Some called it unbelievable, others called it inspiring. Many employees looked at the janitor differently now, no longer as just the man with a broom, but as a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and love. Aisha continued her work, and her project was soon approved for further development. She worked day and night, determined not only to prove herself but also to honor her father's sacrifices. With every report she wrote and every idea she shared, she carried her father's lessons in her heart: never give up, never be ashamed of where you come from, and always work with honesty. Weeks later, the CEO called for another meeting. This time, when the janitor walked into the boardroom, nobody whispered or frowned. Instead, several executives smiled at him respectfully. The CEO himself nodded at him, offering him a chair in the back. The janitor shook his head and chose to stand, as he always did, but this time it was different. He stood not as someone who didn't belong, but as someone quietly respected. The meeting began, And once again, Aisha stood to present updates on her project. She was confident, her words clear and convincing. And once again, her father watched from the back, his pride glowing silently. When the meeting ended, the CEO stood and addressed the room. "Today, I want to remind all of us of something important," he said. His voice carried not just authority but also sincerity. Success is not only built on profits and strategies. It is also built on people, their sacrifices, their struggles, and their dreams. A company is only as strong as the hearts of the people who serve it. And sometimes, those hearts belong to the people we least notice. Everyone in the room knew exactly whom he was speaking about. Their eyes drifted toward the janitor, who stood humbly in the corner. He did not move, but his quiet presence filled the room. The CEO turned to Aisha and then to her father. "She belongs here," he said firmly, and then, with a pause, he added, "and so do you." For the first time, the janitor allowed himself a small smile. It was not a smile of pride or victory, but a smile of peace. He had never wanted recognition, never wanted to sit at the table of executives. All he had ever wanted was to see his daughter stand tall in the world. And now she had. As they walked out of the boardroom together once more, Aisha whispered, "Did you hear what he said?" Her father nodded, his voice quiet but steady. "Yes. But remember, my place has always been behind you, watching you. That is where I belong. Your light is my reward." She squeezed his hand gently, her eyes shining with tears. "And your sacrifices are my strength." The building around them glowed in the evening light, but to them, the true glow was in their hearts. The janitor walked out the doors as the same man he had always been, humble, hard-working, unseen by many. Yet inside, he carried a new peace. His daughter had entered a world he had only dreamed of for her, and she had done it with dignity, honesty, and strength. And though the CEO was still the most powerful man in the company, the story that everyone remembered was not about his wealth or authority. It was about a quiet janitor who stood in the back of a boardroom and changed the meaning of belonging with just 6 words, "I'm here for my daughter." That lesson stayed in the hearts of all who had heard it, that true worth is not defined by titles, money, or power, but by love, sacrifice, and the courage to keep going no matter how hard the road may be.